Welcome to What If Sleep's Storian, where What If whispers timeless tales into dreams. Breathe deeply, let your mind soften, and drift into tonight's gentle story. What if beneath the gaslit streets of London, where fog danced like ancient spirits and shadows held secrets older than memory itself, a mind both brilliant and curious found itself drawn into mysteries that whispered from the very stones? So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let these whispered narratives carry you softly towards sleep. In the heart of Victorian London, where the November fog rolled through cobblestone streets like a living thing, the gaslight flickered against windows that gleamed like amber jewels in the darkness. The year was 1891, and the city breathed with the rhythm of a great slumbering beast. Steam rose from manholes in gentle whispers, and the distant clip-clop of horse hooves echoed through narrow alleyways where shadows pooled like spilled ink. The evening air carried the scent of coal smoke and damp earth, mingling with the faint aroma of tea and tobacco that drifted from the warm glow of public houses. Gas lamps stood like sentinels along the streets, their flames dancing behind glass globes, casting circles of golden light that pushed back the embracing darkness. In this world of brass and leather, of velvet curtains and crackling fireplaces, mysteries lurked in every doorway, and secrets whispered from the very walls. At 221B Baker Street, in rooms that had become synonymous with deduction and logic, a tall, lean figure sat motionless before a dying fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across sharp, angular features, illuminating eyes that seemed to pierce through the veil of ordinary perception. Sherlock Holmes, the consulting detective whose reputation had spread through London like ripples on a still pond, was in one of his contemplative moods, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin as he gazed into the glowing embers. The room around him spoke of a mind both brilliant and restless. Books lay scattered across surfaces, their leather bindings worn smooth by countless readings. Chemical apparatus gleamed dully on a side table, and the air held the faint tang of experiments recently concluded. Persian slippers hung from the mantelpiece, and a pipe rack stood ready for moments of deeper contemplation. It was a sanctuary of intellect, a place where the mundane world gave way to the extraordinary. Dr. Watson sat nearby in his favoured armchair, the leather creaking softly as he shifted position. His medical bag rested at his feet, a constant reminder of his dual nature as both healer and chronicler of mysteries. The good doctor's face bore the gentle weariness of a man who had seen much of the world's darkness, yet retained an unshakable faith in human goodness. His pen moved slowly across paper, recording not case notes, but personal observations, the small details that would later bloom into full narratives of their adventures together. The silence between the two men was comfortable, born of years of shared dangers and quiet moments alike. Outside their window, London breathed its evening rhythm. The fog pressed against the glass like a curious creature, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour with measured solemnity. The fire crackled and whispered, and for a moment all was peaceful in their small corner of the vast, mysterious city. But peace, as Holmes well knew, was often the prelude to something far more intriguing. The sharp rap of knuckles against their front door came precisely at 9 o'clock, echoing up the 17 steps to their rooms with the urgency of genuine distress. Mrs. Hudson's voice could be heard in conversation with the visitor, her Scottish accent warming the formal exchange with maternal concern. Holmes's eyes snapped open, his entire being suddenly alert like a hound catching a scent. The quality of the knock, the weight of footsteps on the stairs, even the timbre of the voice below. All these details flowed into his consciousness, painting a picture of their visitor before the man had even appeared. "A gentleman," Holmes murmured to Watson, his voice barely above a whisper, "recently returned from abroad, military bearing, though no longer in service, carrying news of something that has deeply unsettled him." He pauses on the 7th step, the one that creaks, not from knowledge of our stairs, but because whatever brings him here makes him reluctant to continue. Watson closed his notebook and leaned forward with interest. Years of partnership had taught him that Holmes's first impressions were rarely wrong, and the detective's ability to read the smallest details never failed to fascinate him. The footsteps resumed, climbing more steadily now, and soon Mrs. Hudson appeared at their door, her kind face creased with concern. "A Mr. Ashford to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced, stepping aside to admit their visitor. "He says it's a matter of some urgency." The man who entered their sitting room seemed to carry the very fog of London with him, though it might have been merely the pallor of deep anxiety that gave him such a ghostly appearance. Colonel Reginald Ashford, for his bearing unmistakably proclaimed his military background, was perhaps 50 years of age, with iron-grey hair and a moustache that spoke of campaigns in distant lands. His clothes were well tailored but bore the subtle signs of recent travel. A slight dust on his shoes that suggested country roads, a barely perceptible wrinkle in his coat that spoke of hurried packing. But it was his eyes that drew immediate attention. They held the haunted quality of a man who had witnessed something beyond his understanding, something that had shaken the very foundations of his rational worldview. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves, and when he spoke his voice carried the careful control of one fighting to maintain composure. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, inclining his head in greeting. "I must apologise for the lateness of the hour, but I fear that time is of the essence. I have travelled from Gloucestershire to seek your assistance in a matter most extraordinary." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite his own, and Watson quietly poured tea from the pot that Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully provided. The ritual of hospitality served to calm the Colonel's visible agitation, and the warm glow of the firelight seemed to ease some of the tension from his shoulders. "Please, Colonel," Holmes said gently, having noted the military insignia pin barely visible in the man's lapel. "Take your time. Begin wherever you feel most comfortable." Colonel Ashford accepted the tea with gratitude, wrapping his hands around the warm cup as if drawing strength from its heat. The fog outside their window had thickened, pressing against the glass like curious spirits, and the gaslight from the street below seemed dimmer than usual, as if the very darkness had grown hungry. "It concerns my estate, Ravenshollow Manor in the Cotswolds," the Colonel began, his voice growing steadier as he found his rhythm. "The property has been in my family for 3 generations, built upon land that was once part of a much larger holding. The grounds include several ancient structures, Roman ruins mostly, including what appears to be a burial chamber of considerable age." He paused, sipping his tea and gazing into the fire as if seeking answers in the dancing flames. "Until recently, these ruins were merely curiosities, interesting to antiquarians but of little practical concern. The local villagers have always given the area a wide berth, spinning tales of curses and restless spirits, but I attributed such stories to rural superstition." Watson leaned forward slightly, his medical mind already beginning to categorize and analyze. "What changed, Colonel? What brought you to London in such haste?" The older man's jaw tightened and his grip on the teacup betrayed the depth of his distress. 3 weeks ago, my groundskeeper, William Hartley, disappeared. He was a reliable man, having been with the estate for 15 years. His duties included maintaining the grounds around the ruins, and he showed no fear of the old stones. On the morning of his disappearance, he was seen heading toward the burial chamber with his tools, intending to clear away some overgrown brambles. The Colonel set down his cup with careful precision, as if afraid that any sudden movement might shatter his composure. "He never returned. We searched the entire estate, questioned every villager, and contacted the local constabulary. It was as if he had simply vanished." Holmes's fingers drummed silently against his knee, a sure sign that his analytical mind was already working through the possibilities. "You said this was 3 weeks ago. Have there been other incidents?" 2 more disappearances, Colonel Ashford replied grimly. A week after Hartley vanished, a young woman from the village, Sarah Mitchell, barely 19 years old, was found to be missing from her family's cottage. She had been seen the previous evening walking along the lane that borders my property, though she had no business there. Like Hartley, she simply disappeared without a trace. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and somewhere in the distance the sound of a hansom cab clattered across cobblestones. The fog seemed to press closer against their window, as if eager to listen to the tale being told within. "And the third disappearance," Watson prompted gently. He was a methodical man, meticulous in his work. He had made several interesting discoveries in recent weeks: pottery fragments, coins, and most intriguingly, a series of carved stone tablets covered in symbols that he believed might predate even the Roman occupation. Holmes leaned forward, his grey eyes sharpening with interest. These symbols? Did Dr. Blackwood share his findings with anyone? Were his notes preserved? "That's just it, Mr. Holmes," the Colonel replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "His tent and equipment remain exactly as he left them, but his most recent notes, particularly those concerning the symbol-covered tablets, have vanished along with the man himself. It's as if someone, or something, specifically wanted to prevent those discoveries from being revealed." The detective rose from his chair and began to pace before the fireplace, his tall frame casting long shadows across the room. This was a sure sign that the problem had captured his complete attention, and Watson settled back in his chair, recognizing the beginning of one of Holmes's analytical processes. "Tell me about the burial chamber itself," Holmes requested, his voice carrying the focused intensity that Watson knew so well. Its construction, its orientation, any unusual features that might be significant. Colonel Ashford seemed relieved to discuss concrete details rather than the disturbing pattern of disappearances. "It's built into a small hill, what the locals call Sorrow's Mound. The entrance faces east toward the rising sun, which Dr. Blackwood found significant. The chamber itself is perhaps 20 feet in length, constructed of massive stone blocks fitted together without mortar. The craftsmanship is remarkable. Whoever built it possessed considerable skill and resources." He paused, running a hand through his greying hair. "There are carved symbols throughout the interior, covering nearly every surface. Dr. Blackwood was particularly excited about these, claiming they were unlike anything he'd encountered in his studies of Roman Britain. Some appeared to be much older, possibly predating the Roman occupation by centuries." Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to face their visitor. "Have you yourself entered this chamber, Colonel?" "Several times, though I must admit it's not a comfortable place to spend time. There's something about the atmosphere, a heaviness, a sense of watching. I attributed it to the enclosed space and the weight of history, but I confess that each visit left me feeling increasingly uneasy." The detective nodded thoughtfully. "And the local villagers, what do they say about recent events?" Colonel Ashford's expression grew troubled. "They've become increasingly agitated, speaking of ancient curses awakening and evil stirring beneath the earth. Old women cross themselves when they pass my gates, and several families have sent their children to stay with relatives in neighbouring parishes. The village pub, normally a source of jovial conversation, has grown quiet and subdued." Watson set aside his notebook and leaned forward. "Colonel, forgive the question, but have you considered the possibility that these disappearances might have a more mundane explanation? Perhaps the three individuals simply chose to leave the area for personal reasons." The Colonel shook his head emphatically. "Doctor, Watson, that was my first hope as well, but William Hartley left behind a wife and 3 young children who depended entirely on his wages. Sarah Mitchell was engaged to be married to the blacksmith's son, with the wedding planned for next month. And Dr. Blackwood was on the verge of what he believed would be the most significant archaeological discovery of his career. None of them had any reason to abandon their lives so suddenly." Holmes resumed his seat, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, in his characteristic gesture of deep thought. The fire had burned lower now, casting longer shadows across the room, and the fog outside seemed to have thickened until it obscured even the gaslight from the street below. "You mentioned that Dr. Blackwood believed he was close to a significant discovery," Holmes said after a long moment. "Did he share the nature of this discovery with you?" "Only in the vaguest terms," the Colonel replied. "He spoke of finding evidence of a pre-Roman cult, possibly connected to ancient burial practices. He was particularly excited about a series of symbols that he believed might represent some form of religious or ceremonial significance. He mentioned that he had begun to see patterns in the carvings, connections that suggested a much more complex belief system than previously thought." The detective's eyes gleamed with the light of intellectual challenge. "And you say his most recent notes concerning these discoveries have disappeared?" "Completely. His earlier notebooks remain, documenting his initial surveys and basic cataloguing of artefacts, but anything related to his final weeks of work, particularly his analysis of the symbol patterns, has vanished without a trace. Holmes was quiet for several minutes, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Watson recognised this silence as the detective's mind working through the available information, sorting and categorising, looking for the patterns that others might miss. Finally, Holmes spoke. "Colonel Ashford, I believe your instincts in coming to London were correct. There are elements to this case that suggest something far more complex than simple coincidence or rural superstition. With your permission, Doctor, Watson and I will travel to Gloucestershire tomorrow to examine the site and investigate these disappearances more thoroughly." Relief flooded the Colonel's features, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Mr. Holmes, I cannot express how grateful I am. I had feared that you might dismiss this as mere country folklore." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, rising to escort their visitor to the door. "I find that the most seemingly supernatural mysteries often have the most fascinating rational explanations. However, I must warn you that our investigation may uncover truths that prove more disturbing than the mysteries themselves." After Colonel Ashford had departed into the foggy London night, Holmes and Watson sat in comfortable silence before their dying fire. The detective's mind was clearly still working through the details they had been given, while Watson made final notes in his journal, recording impressions and initial observations that might prove significant later. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" Watson asked eventually, setting aside his pen. Holmes reached for his pipe, filling it with practiced movements while he considered the question. 3 disappearances in 3 weeks, all connected to an ancient burial site that has suddenly become the focus of archaeological investigation. The timing is too precise to be coincidental, Watson. Someone or some group has a very specific interest in that tomb and is willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect its secrets. He lit his pipe, and the sweet aroma of tobacco began to fill the room, mixing with the scents of leather and old books that made their lodgings feel so much like home. The fact that Dr. Blackwood's most recent notes have been selectively removed suggests that he discovered something significant, something that someone was desperate to suppress. Watson nodded thoughtfully. But surely if it were simply a matter of valuable archaeological artefacts, there would be easier ways to acquire them than through abduction. "Precisely, my dear fellow," Holmes agreed, smoke curling around his sharp features. "Which suggests that the value of whatever lies in that tomb is not monetary in the conventional sense. No, I suspect we're dealing with something far more complex, perhaps a group that places religious or symbolic significance on the site." The fire had nearly died now, leaving only glowing embers to warm the room. Outside their window, the fog had grown so thick that even the gaslight from the street had become nothing more than a dim, diffused glow. London seemed to have wrapped itself in mystery, as if the very city were preparing for the strange case that awaited them. "A cult, perhaps," Watson suggested. His medical mind automatically considers the psychological implications. "Some group that views the tomb as sacred," Holmes nodded approvingly. The thought occurred to me as well. The selective nature of the disappearances, the careful removal of specific information, the timing coinciding with archaeological discoveries. All these elements suggest an organised group acting with deliberate purpose, rather than random criminal activity. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out into the impenetrable fog that had swallowed the familiar streets of their neighbourhood. "Whatever we discover in Gloucestershire, Watson, I suspect it will test not only our deductive abilities, but perhaps our understanding of the boundaries between ancient superstition and modern reality." Watson joined his friend at the window, and together they stood watching the fog swirl and dance in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. Somewhere in that grey void, London continued its nightly rhythm. Hansoms clattered along invisible streets, late workers made their way home to waiting families, and gas lamps flickered against the encroaching darkness. But tonight the fog seemed different somehow, charged with mystery and possibility. It was as if the very air around them whispered of ancient secrets and hidden truths, of forces that operated beyond the comfortable boundaries of Victorian rationality. "We should retire early," Holmes said, finally turning away from the window. "Tomorrow we journey into the past, Watson, to a place where the old ways still hold power, and where modern men have learned to fear things they cannot understand." As they prepared for sleep, neither man could have anticipated how prophetic those words would prove to be. In the guest room that Mrs. Hudson had prepared for the night, Colonel Ashford lay awake listening to the fog pressing against his window, wondering if he had been right to seek help, or if he had merely drawn 2 more souls into the web of darkness that had settled over Ravenshollow Manor. And in the thick, swirling fog that blanketed London, shapes seemed to move with purpose, as if the very mists carried messages to those who knew how to read their ancient language. The city slept fitfully that night, troubled by dreams of standing stones and symbols carved in darkness, of burial chambers where the dead did not rest peacefully, and of secrets that some would kill to preserve. Morning came slowly to London, the autumn sun struggling to penetrate the thick fog that had settled over the city like a grey blanket. In their rooms at Baker Street, Holmes and Watson prepared for their journey to Gloucestershire, with the methodical care that had served them well in previous investigations. Holmes packed his magnifying glass, measuring tape, and various chemical testing supplies, while Watson ensured that his medical bag contained everything necessary for extended travel. Mrs. Hudson had prepared a hearty breakfast, sensing that her lodgers were about to embark on another of their mysterious adventures. She fussed over them with maternal concern, pressing additional sandwiches into Watson's hands and reminding Holmes to eat regular meals, knowing full well that once he became absorbed in a case, he was likely to forget such mundane necessities. Colonel Ashford arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, looking somewhat better after a night's rest, but still bearing the haunted expression of a man carrying terrible knowledge. He had arranged for a private railway car to transport them to the nearest station to his estate, and a carriage would meet them there for the final journey to Ravenshollow Manor. The train journey through the English countryside provided an opportunity for further discussion of the case. As London fell away behind them, and they travelled through villages and farmland touched with autumn's golden palette, Holmes continued his methodical questioning of their host. Every detail of the estate's history, the recent archaeological work and the circumstances surrounding the disappearances was examined and analysed. "Tell me more about Dr. Blackwood's discoveries," Holmes requested as they passed through a small market town where church spires rose like fingers pointing toward the overcast sky. "You mentioned pottery fragments and coins, but it was the symbol-covered tablets that seemed to excite him most." Colonel Ashford gazed out at the passing landscape, where farmers were bringing in the last of the harvest, and smoke rose from cottage chimneys like gentle prayers. He found the first tablet quite by accident, buried beneath what appeared to be a ceremonial altar stone within the burial chamber. It was slate, carved with symbols that he said were unlike any he had encountered in his studies of Celtic or Roman inscriptions. The train's rhythm was hypnotic, and Watson found himself being lulled by the gentle swaying and the soft clicking of wheels on track. Outside the window the countryside rolled past like pages from a pastoral poem. Rolling hills dotted with sheep, ancient oak trees that had watched centuries pass, and stone walls that had marked boundaries since time immemorial. Dr. Blackwood became convinced that he had discovered evidence of a previously unknown religious cult, the colonel continued. He believed that the burial chamber was not merely a tomb, but a temple of sorts, a place where ancient rituals were performed. The symbols on the tablets seemed to support this theory, depicting what appeared to be ceremonial practices involving burial and resurrection. Holmes leaned forward with keen interest. Resurrection? That's quite a significant claim. What evidence did he have for such an interpretation? The tablets showed sequences of symbols that he interpreted as depicting death and rebirth. There were images of bodies being placed in the earth, followed by symbols he believed represented transformation or awakening. He was particularly intrigued by recurring motifs that seemed to show the boundary between life and death as permeable, changeable. Watson felt a slight chill despite the warm compartment. As a medical man, he had seen death in many forms and had always viewed it as the ultimate boundary, the final punctuation mark in the sentence of existence. The idea of ancient peoples who believed otherwise, who perhaps actively sought to manipulate that boundary, was deeply unsettling. The train began to slow as they approached their destination, and through the window they could see the small station where their carriage waited. The countryside here had a different quality than the gentler regions they had passed through earlier. The hills were higher and more rugged, and there was something indefinably older about the landscape, as if the very earth remembered times and peoples long forgotten by written history. Colonel Ashford's estate carriage proved to be a well-appointed vehicle, drawn by two magnificent bay horses. The driver, a weathered man named Thomas who had served the family for many years, touched his cap respectfully, but Holmes noticed that his eyes held the same haunted quality that seemed to affect everyone connected to recent events at Ravenshollow Manor. As they drove through the Gloucestershire countryside, Holmes observed the gradual change in the character of their surroundings. The rolling farmland gave way to wilder terrain, where ancient forests pressed close to the road and standing stones could be glimpsed in distant fields. This was older England, a place where Roman legions had once marched and where Celtic tribes had worshipped gods whose names were lost to time. The village that bordered Colonel Ashford's estate was a picturesque cluster of stone cottages surrounding a Norman church, whose square tower had watched over the community for 800 years. But as their carriage passed through the village, Holmes noticed that the usual bustle of rural life was subdued. Windows were shuttered despite the daylight hour, and the few villagers visible on the streets moved quickly and purposefully, avoiding eye contact with strangers. "The atmosphere has changed considerably since the disappearances began," Colonel Ashford observed, noting Holmes's scrutiny of the village. "These people have lived their entire lives with stories of the cursed tomb, but until recently it remained merely an interesting bit of local folklore. Now they believe the old warnings are coming true." Ravenshollow Manor stood at the end of a long drive lined with ancient oak trees whose branches formed a cathedral-like canopy overhead. The house itself was a fine example of Georgian architecture, built of honey-coloured Cotswold stone that seemed to glow warmly despite the overcast afternoon. Ivy climbed its walls in carefully managed patterns, and the windows gleamed like friendly eyes welcoming visitors home. But it was the view beyond the manor house that drew Holmes's immediate attention. Perhaps half a mile across the carefully maintained grounds, a small hill rose from the landscape like a green tumour. Even at this distance, there was something unsettling about its perfect symmetry, something that suggested human hands had shaped its contours in ages past. "Sorrow's Mound," Colonel Ashford said quietly, following Holmes's gaze. "The burial chamber is built into its eastern face, hidden by centuries of accumulated earth and vegetation. From here, it looks quite peaceful, doesn't it? One would never suspect the darkness that seems to emanate from those ancient stones." Mrs. Ashford, a gracious woman in her middle years, greeted them at the manor's front door with the practised hospitality of a military wife who had entertained guests from around the world. But Holmes noted that even her warm smile could not entirely mask the strain that recent events had placed upon the household. The servants who took their luggage moved with the subdued efficiency of people living under the shadow of inexplicable fear. The interior of Ravenshollow Manor spoke of generations of comfortable country living. Persian carpets covered polished oak floors, and the walls were lined with family portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow visitors through the rooms. A fire crackled welcomingly in the great hall's massive stone fireplace, and the scent of beeswax and lavender spoke of careful housekeeping and feminine attention to detail. After a light luncheon and brief rest to recover from their journey, Holmes was eager to begin his examination of the mysterious burial chamber. Colonel Ashford had provided them with detailed maps of the estate grounds, and he insisted on personally guiding them to the site despite his obvious reluctance to revisit the place. The walk across the manor grounds was pleasant enough, following well-maintained paths that wound through formal gardens and past a small ornamental lake where swans moved with serene grace. But as they approached Sorrow's Mound, the very atmosphere seemed to change. The air grew cooler, and a subtle but persistent breeze arose from no identifiable source, rustling the leaves of nearby trees with whispered secrets. The burial chamber's entrance was a dark rectangle set into the hillside, barely visible behind a screen of brambles and ivy that had been partially cleared away. Dr. Blackwood's archaeological equipment still sat nearby under canvas covers, looking somehow forlorn and abandoned. His carefully gridded excavation areas and methodical notes spoke of scholarly enthusiasm that had been brutally interrupted. Holmes examined the entrance carefully, noting the massive stone lintels and the precise fitting of the ancient blocks. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured, running his hands along the carved symbols that decorated the entrance stones. "These markings are clearly very old, possibly pre-Roman, as Dr. Blackwood suggested." Watson stood nearby, fighting an inexplicable urge to step away from the dark opening. As a rational man and a physician, he was not given to superstitious fancies, but something about the burial chamber entrance seemed to emanate a cold that had nothing to do with autumn weather. It was as if the very stones remembered ancient purposes that were better left undisturbed. Colonel Ashford had brought several lanterns, and these were lit before the trio entered the narrow passage that led into the heart of the mound. The walls pressed close around them, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and move in the flickering lantern light. The air inside was still and heavy, carrying scents of earth and age and something else. Something that reminded Watson uncomfortably of the dissecting rooms of his medical training. The main chamber opened out into a space perhaps 20 feet in length and half that in width, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above their lights. But it was the walls that immediately captured attention. Every available surface was covered with carved symbols, arranged in complex patterns that seemed to tell stories or convey information in a language lost to time. Holmes moved through the chamber like a scholar in a library, his lantern held high as he examined each section of carved wall with intense concentration. The symbols varied from simple geometric patterns to complex figures that might represent people, animals, or abstract concepts. Some were carved deeply into the stone, while others were mere scratches, as if added hastily by different hands across many years. Dr. Blackwood was right, Holmes said quietly, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. This is no simple burial chamber. The complexity and organisation of these symbols suggest a sophisticated belief system, possibly involving elaborate rituals performed within this very space. At the far end of the chamber, a raised stone platform dominated the space. It was clearly designed as an altar of some kind, with channels carved into its surface that led to a central depression. The purpose of these channels was uncomfortably obvious to anyone familiar with ancient sacrificial practices. Watson examined the altar stone with professional interest, noting stains that had penetrated deeply into the rock despite the passage of centuries. "Holmes," he said quietly, "I believe this platform was used for more than symbolic ceremonies. These stains suggest actual bloodletting, possibly on a regular basis over extended periods." The detective nodded grimly. And yet the chamber was also clearly used for burial purposes. See those niches carved into the walls? They were designed to hold bodies, though whether to sacrifice victims or honour the dead is unclear. Colonel Ashford remained near the entrance, clearly uncomfortable with the atmosphere of the place, but determined to assist in whatever way possible. Dr. Blackwood spent hours here during his final weeks, often working by lamplight until well after dark. The servants began to worry about him, saying he was becoming obsessed with deciphering the symbol patterns. Holmes had found the spot where Dr. Blackwood had discovered the carved tablets, a cavity behind the altar stone that had been concealed by centuries of accumulated debris. The archaeologist's careful notes indicated that he had found 3 stone tablets here, covered with symbols that seemed to be a more elaborate version of the wall carvings. These tablets were the key to his theory about resurrection rituals, Colonel Ashford explained. He believed they contained instructions or formulas for ceremonies designed to bring the dead back to life. He spent his final days trying to translate them, convinced he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionise understanding of ancient British religious practices. The detective examined the cavity carefully, noting traces of recent disturbance that suggested someone had returned after Dr. Blackwood's disappearance to remove any remaining evidence. The selectivity was telling. Other artefacts remained untouched, but anything related to the tablets and their translation had been systematically eliminated. As they prepared to leave the burial chamber, Holmes paused at the entrance to examine the symbols carved into the lintel stone. Unlike the complex patterns inside the chamber, these seemed more like warnings or protective formulas, repeated motifs that might have been designed to keep something in rather than keep intruders out. "Interesting," he murmured, tracing one particularly deep carving with his finger. These symbols appear to be more recent than those inside the chamber, possibly added centuries after the original construction. Someone felt the need to seal this place, to add additional protections to whatever was already here. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as they emerged from the burial chamber, painting the countryside in shades of gold and amber that should have been beautiful but somehow seemed ominous in the context of their investigation. The very beauty of the landscape seemed fragile, as if darkness lurked just beneath its pastoral surface. Back at Ravenshollow Manor, Holmes spent the evening examining Dr. Blackwood's remaining notes and artefacts, spreading them across the library table, while Watson documented their observations from the burial chamber. Colonel Ashford provided additional details about the 3 missing persons, painting pictures of ordinary people whose lives had been disrupted by forces beyond their understanding. William Hartley, the groundskeeper, had been a steady, reliable man who supported his family through careful attention to his duties. He had shown no fear of the burial chamber, treating it as merely another part of the estate grounds that required maintenance. His wife described him as excited about his work on the day of his disappearance, pleased to be contributing to Dr. Blackwood's archaeological project. Sarah Mitchell, the young woman from the village, had been engaged to marry the blacksmith's son. She was described as level-headed and practical, not given to romantic fancies or reckless behaviour. Her family could think of no reason why she might have been near the estate grounds on the evening she disappeared, as she had no business there and knew better than to wander alone after dark. Dr. Edmund Blackwood presented a more complex case. His academic credentials were impeccable, and his previous archaeological work had been methodical and scholarly. But his letters to colleagues during his final weeks at Ravenshollow showed increasing excitement bordering on obsession, as if he had discovered something that challenged his fundamental understanding of ancient history. "The pattern is clear enough," Holmes said as the evening wore on. "Each disappearance occurred at a time when the individual was either directly involved with the burial chamber or in close proximity to it. Someone is protecting the site and its secrets, using methods that leave no trace of conventional criminal activity." Watson looked up from his notes. But what could be so significant about these ancient symbols that someone would resort to abduction? Surely any archaeological discovery, however remarkable, could be managed through legitimate academic channels. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the library window, gazing out across the darkened grounds toward the invisible shape of Sorrow's Mound. "Unless, my dear Watson, the discovery involves something that threatens the foundations of someone's beliefs or power. Consider the possibility that Dr. Blackwood stumbled upon evidence of practices that some group considers sacred, secrets they have protected for generations." The detective's reflection in the window glass looked pale and insubstantial, like a ghost contemplating mysteries beyond mortal understanding. Outside, the night seemed unusually dark, as if clouds had gathered to obscure even the faint light of stars and moon. "Occult," Watson mused, following his friend's line of reasoning. "Some group that traces its origins back to the ancient peoples who built the burial chamber, still practicing rituals based on those carved symbols." "The thought had occurred to me," Holmes agreed. "Consider the evidence. An organised group with specific knowledge of the site, the ability to act decisively when their secrets are threatened, and the resources to make people disappear without leaving conventional traces. They may have tolerated casual interest in the ruins for years, but Dr. Blackwood's systematic investigation and breakthrough discoveries crossed some invisible line." Colonel Ashford had been listening to this exchange with growing unease. "Mr. Holmes, are you suggesting that there are people in this area who still practice these ancient rituals? That they might be dangerous?" Holmes turned from the window, his sharp features thoughtful in the lamplight. "I'm suggesting that we're dealing with individuals who place extraordinary value on maintaining certain secrets, Colonel. Whether their motives are religious, financial, or something else entirely remains to be determined. The night settled over Ravenshollow Manor like a heavy blanket, and despite the warmth of the library fire, all three men found themselves conscious of the darkness pressing against the windows. Somewhere in that darkness lay Sorrow's Mound, its ancient stones holding secrets that had already cost 3 people their freedom, if not their lives. Watson closed his notebook and rubbed his tired eyes. "What do you propose for tomorrow, Holmes? How do we proceed when we're dealing with adversaries who leave no conventional traces?" The detective's smile was thin but determined. "We return to the burial chamber, my dear fellow, but this time we approach it as those ancient peoples would have done. We examine not just the physical evidence but the spiritual and psychological landscape surrounding it. Someone has been using that site for purposes that go far beyond mere historical interest, and I intend to discover exactly what those purposes might be." Outside the library windows, the darkness seemed to pulse with hidden life, as if the very night were alive with ancient purposes. The 3 men retired eventually to their respective chambers, but sleep came fitfully to Ravenshollow Manor that night. In his dreams, Watson found himself walking through passages lined with carved symbols that writhed and changed as he watched, while Holmes dreamed of voices speaking in languages that predated human memory, calling to him from depths that had never known sunlight. The morning brought little relief from the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to surround the estate. A thick mist had risen from the valley, obscuring the grounds in grey veils that muffled sound and limited visibility to mere yards in any direction. When Holmes and Watson met for breakfast, they found Colonel Ashford already dressed and waiting, his military bearing somewhat restored by the light of day, but his eyes still holding the haunted quality that had become so familiar. "I've been thinking about your theory regarding a cult," the Colonel said without preamble as they sat down to Mrs. Ashford's excellent breakfast. "If such a group exists in this area, they would need to be people with intimate knowledge of the local geography and history. They would have to be individuals who could move about the countryside without arousing suspicion." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely, which suggests either long-time residents of the area or individuals with legitimate reasons for being here regularly. Have there been any strangers in the vicinity during recent months? Anyone who might have been studying the burial chamber or asking questions about local history?" "Apart from Dr. Blackwood himself, only a few visitors that I'm aware of," Colonel Ashford replied. "There was a gentleman from London, a Mr. Cornelius Marsh, who claimed to be writing a book about ancient British religious sites. He spent several days in the village about 6 weeks ago, asking questions and taking photographs. And there was a woman, Miss Victoria Hale, who said she was researching her family genealogy and believed her ancestors might have lived in this area centuries ago." Watson leaned forward with interest. "Did either of these individuals show specific interest in your burial chamber?" "Mr. Marsh certainly did. He asked permission to visit the site and spent an entire afternoon there, taking detailed measurements and photographs. He seemed particularly interested in the carved symbols, though he claimed to be merely documenting them for his book. Miss Hale was more circumspect, but I noticed her walking near the mound on several occasions, always at dawn or dusk when she might not be easily observed." Holmes's eyes gleamed with the light of discovery. "And when did these visits occur in relation to Dr. Blackwood's breakthrough discoveries?" Colonel Ashford considered it carefully. "Mr. Marsh's visit was perhaps 2 weeks before Dr. Blackwood found the first tablet. Miss Hale spent nearly a week in the area, staying at the village inn, and her final visit to the mound coincided almost exactly with the discovery of the tablets." The detective rose from his chair and began pacing before the breakfast room windows, his tall frame casting long shadows in the morning light. "2 individuals with suspiciously convenient interests in your burial chamber, arriving just as Dr. Blackwood was making his most significant discoveries. I think it's time we had a closer look at these mysterious visitors." The mist had begun to clear by the time they set out for the village, revealing a countryside that seemed somehow different in daylight. The ancient landscape that had appeared so ominous the previous evening now showed its gentler face, with rolling hills dotted by grazing sheep and hedgerows bright with autumn berries. But Holmes noted that even the beauty of the morning could not entirely dispel the sense of watchfulness that seemed to emanate from the very stones and trees. The village inn, a picturesque establishment called the Lamb and Flag, dated back to Tudor times and had clearly been serving travellers for centuries. Its half-timbered facade and diamond-paned windows spoke of age and stability, while smoke rising from its chimneys promised warmth and hospitality within. The innkeeper, a robust man named Aldrich Pumphrey, greeted them with the careful courtesy due to guests of Colonel Ashford, but also with the subtle wariness that seemed to affect everyone in the area. "Certainly I remember both visitors," Mr. Pumphrey said, when Holmes inquired about the London gentleman and the genealogy researcher. Mr. Marsh was a pleasant enough fellow, very interested in local history and traditions, spent most of his evenings in the tap room, buying drinks for the older residents and getting them to tell stories about the ancient times. He paused, polishing a glass with mechanical precision, while his eyes grew distant with memory. Miss Hale was a different sort entirely, kept to herself mostly, though she was polite when spoken to. Beautiful woman, well dressed. But there was something about her, something that made folks uncomfortable. She had a way of looking at you, as if she could see things that others couldn't. Watson exchanged a meaningful glance with Holmes. Did either of them ask specifically about Sorrow's Mound or the burial chamber? Not directly, no, the innkeeper replied. But they were both very interested when the older folks started telling the old stories about the cursed tomb and the warnings passed down through generations. Mr. Marsh seemed to treat it all as folklore, but Miss Hale, she listened to every word as if it were the most important information she'd ever heard. Holmes leaned forward with keen interest. "What sort of warnings, Mr. Pumphrey? What do the old stories say about the burial chamber?" The innkeeper's expression grew uncomfortable, and he glanced around the empty tap room as if afraid of being overheard. "Ancient stories, Mr. Holmes, the kind that mothers tell their children to keep them from wandering too far from home. Tales of the old people who built the tomb, who worshipped dark gods and practiced rituals that were forbidden even in those brutal times." He set down the glass and leaned across the bar, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "The stories say that the burial chamber was built not to house the dead, but to control them. That the symbols carved into the walls are formulas for binding souls to the earth, preventing them from finding peace. The old folks claim that on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the mist rises from the valley, you can hear voices calling from within the mound, the voices of those who are sacrificed to feed the ancient hunger that sleeps beneath the stones." Watson felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the inn's common room. As a man of science, he dismissed such tales as superstition, but there was something in the innkeeper's manner that suggested genuine fear rather than mere storytelling. "And what happens," Holmes asked quietly, "to those who disturb the tomb or try to unlock its secrets?" Mr. Pumphrey's face went pale, and he crossed himself with the automatic gesture of deep-rooted fear. "The stories say they're taken, Mr. Holmes, claimed by the old powers that still guard the chamber. Some say they're used in rituals that keep the ancient hunger satisfied. Others believe they're transformed, made into servants of whatever sleeps beneath Sorrow's Mound." The three men left the inn with much to consider, walking through the village streets where normal life seemed to continue despite the undercurrent of fear that affected everyone they met. Children played in cottage gardens under the watchful eyes of nervous mothers, and men worked at their trades with an efficiency that spoke of wanting to finish tasks quickly and return to the safety of their homes. As they passed the Norman church with its square stone tower, Holmes paused to examine the ancient graveyard that surrounded it. Many of the older headstones bore symbols that seemed oddly familiar, echoing motifs they had seen carved into the walls of the burial chamber. The church itself appeared to have been built with stones that might have come from much older structures, possibly Roman or even pre-Roman sites. "Interesting how the church seems to have been positioned," Holmes observed, noting its relationship to the surrounding landscape. "From here, one has a clear view of Sorrow's Mound, almost as if the building were designed to keep watch over the ancient site." Watson followed his friend's gaze across the valley to where the mound rose like a green tumour from the pastoral landscape. Even in broad daylight, there was something unsettling about its perfect symmetry, something that suggested human hands had shaped its contours according to purposes that had nothing to do with natural geography. The early Christians often built their churches on sites that had been sacred to earlier religions, Watson noted. Perhaps this church was meant to consecrate ground that had been considered unholy. Colonel Ashford nodded agreement. The church records date back to the Norman conquest, but local tradition suggests there was a Saxon church here before that, and possibly a Roman shrine before that. The land has been considered sacred in one form or another for over 1,000 years. They walked back toward Ravenshollow Manor, along lanes bordered by ancient hedgerows, where blackbirds called from hidden perches, and the late morning sun cast long shadows across the countryside. But as they approached the estate grounds, the atmosphere began to change again, as if they were entering a region where different laws applied, where the comfortable certainties of the modern world gave way to older, more primal realities. Holmes spent the afternoon examining Dr. Blackwood's remaining papers and artefacts with the methodical thoroughness that had made him famous throughout London. The archaeologist's early notes showed careful, scholarly analysis of his discoveries, but his final entries revealed a growing excitement that bordered on obsession. "Listen to this," Holmes said, reading from Dr. Blackwood's journal. "The symbols on the third tablet clearly show a sequence of ritual actions designed to maintain communication with entities that exist between life and death. The implications are staggering. If my translations are correct, these ancient peoples believed they could control the boundary between the living world and whatever lies beyond." He turned to another entry, dated just 3 days before the archaeologist's disappearance. "I am convinced now that the burial chamber is not merely a historical artifact, but an active site where rituals may still be performed. The wear patterns on the altar stone suggest recent use, and I have found evidence of offerings left within the chamber, flowers, coins, even what appears to be bloodstains that cannot be more than a few months old." Watson looked up from his own examination of the artefacts. So Dr. Blackwood suspected that someone was still using the chamber for ritual purposes. That might explain why his disappearance was timed so precisely. He was getting too close to discovering who these modern practitioners might be. The detective nodded grimly. And his final entry, made on the very day he vanished, shows that he believed he had identified the leader of this contemporary cult. Holmes read from the journal with particular emphasis. "The woman who has been observing my work is no mere genealogy researcher. Her knowledge of the ancient symbols is too comprehensive, too intuitive to be academic. She moves through the countryside as if she owns it, and the local people treat her with a deference that borders on fear. I believe she may be the key to understanding how the ancient practices have survived into the modern era." Colonel Ashford leaned forward with sharp interest. "That must be Miss Hale, the woman who stayed at the inn. Dr. Blackwood suspected her of being involved with these mysterious rituals." "More than suspected," Holmes replied, turning to the final page of entries. He had apparently arranged to confront her directly. His last note reads, "Tomorrow evening I will meet with Miss Hale at the burial chamber. She has promised to reveal the true history of the site and the ongoing activities there. I believe I am about to make the most significant archaeological discovery of our time." The implications hung heavy in the air of the library as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the manor grounds. Dr. Blackwood had walked willingly into what might have been a trap, lured by the promise of knowledge that proved too tempting to resist. Watson closed his notebook and rubbed his tired eyes. So we have at least 2 individuals, Miss Hale and possibly Mr. Marsh, who showed suspicious interest in the burial chamber, just as Dr. Blackwood was making his breakthrough discoveries. And we have evidence suggesting that the chamber is still being used for ritual purposes by people with extensive knowledge of the ancient practices. Holmes rose from his chair and moved to the library window, gazing out across the grounds toward the invisible presence of Sorrow's Mound. The day was drawing toward evening, and mist was beginning to rise from the valley, creating an atmosphere that seemed charged with possibility and danger. "I believe it's time for a more direct approach," the detective said quietly. "Tonight, after full darkness has fallen, we will return to the burial chamber and conduct our own vigil. If these modern practitioners are still active, they may reveal themselves when they believe the site is unobserved." Colonel Ashford's face went pale. "Mr. Holmes, surely that's extremely dangerous. if these people have already taken 3 individuals who interfered with their activities, which is precisely why we must act quickly, Holmes replied with characteristic determination. Each day of delay potentially puts more innocent people at risk. Better to confront this mystery directly than to allow it to continue claiming victims. As evening approached, the 3 men made careful preparations for their nocturnal investigation. Holmes packed his magnifying glass, camera, and various scientific instruments, while Watson ensured that his medical bag contained supplies for treating potential injuries. Colonel Ashford reluctantly agreed to guide them to the burial chamber, but insisted on bringing several loaded firearms, despite Holmes's preference for more subtle methods of investigation. The dinner at Ravenshollow Manor was a subdued affair, with Mrs. Ashford clearly aware that her husband and guests were planning some dangerous nighttime activity, but too well bred to ask direct questions. The servants moved about their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who sensed approaching a crisis but could do nothing to prevent it. As full darkness settled over the Gloucestershire countryside, the 3 men set out across the estate grounds with carefully shielded lanterns and a grim determination to uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearances. The night air was cool and still, carrying scents of autumn earth and dying leaves, but underneath these familiar odours lay something else. A musty, ancient smell that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. The walk to Sorrow's Mound took them through formal gardens that looked ghostly in the faint starlight, past the ornamental lake where swans moved like pale spirits across the dark water, and finally into the wilder regions of the estate, where ancient trees pressed close to the path and shadows seemed to move with purposeful intent. As they approached the burial chamber, Holmes signalled for complete silence and extinguished his lantern. The mound loomed before them like a sleeping giant, its grassy slopes silver with dew and its dark entrance barely visible in the surrounding vegetation. But there was light within the chamber, a faint flickering glow that suggested candles or torches burning in the ancient depths. Watson felt his heart begin to race as they crept closer to the entrance. The sound of voices drifted from within the chamber, speaking in what seemed to be a mixture of English and some older language, possibly Celtic or pre-Celtic in origin. The cadence was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, suggesting some form of ritual chanting or ceremonial recitation. Holmes positioned himself where he could observe the chamber entrance, while Watson and Colonel Ashford took covering positions nearby. The detective's training in observation and deduction had prepared him for many strange situations, but even he felt a chill of apprehension as the chanting grew louder and more intense. Figures began to emerge from the burial chamber, 7 individuals dressed in dark robes that concealed their faces and identities. They moved with the practiced coordination of people who had performed these actions many times before, arranging themselves around the chamber entrance in a pattern that seemed to correspond to the carved symbols visible on the ancient stones. At the centre of the group stood a woman whose bearing and position clearly marked her as the leader. Even in the dim light, her beauty was striking, and there was something in her posture that commanded immediate attention and respect from her followers. Holmes had no doubt that this was Miss Victoria Hale, the genealogy researcher, who had shown such suspicious interest in the burial chamber. The ritual continued for nearly an hour, with chanting that rose and fell like ocean waves, punctuated by offerings placed at various points around the mound. Holmes observed the proceedings with the focused attention of a scientist studying a new species, noting every detail that might later prove significant. But it was what happened at the ritual's climax that changed everything. 3 figures were led from the burial chamber, figures that moved with the mechanical precision of people under some form of influence or control. Even in the darkness, Holmes could see enough to confirm his worst fears. William Hartley, Sarah Mitchell, and Dr. Edmund Blackwood were alive, but clearly not acting under their own free will. The missing persons stood motionless while the robed figures continued their chanting, and Holmes realised that whatever had been done to them went far beyond simple kidnapping. Their faces were blank, their movements unnaturally coordinated, and their eyes reflected the flickering candlelight with an empty quality that suggested consciousness without will. Watson, observing from his concealed position, felt his medical training rebel against what he was witnessing. As a physician, he had seen many conditions that affected mental function, but nothing in his experience suggested that human beings could be reduced to such a state of mechanical compliance without obvious physical trauma. The ritual reached its crescendo as Miss Hale raised her arms toward the dark sky and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the night air. "Ancient ones who sleep beneath the earth, accept these offerings of living will and conscious thought. Let their sacrifice maintain the boundaries between what was and what shall be, between the world of the living and the realm of eternal service." Holmes realized with cold certainty that they were witnessing something far more sinister than simple kidnapping or even murder. The 3 missing persons had been transformed into something else entirely, their individual personalities and wills somehow subsumed into service to whatever force these modern cultists believed they were serving. The detective made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Rather than attempting to intervene directly, which might result in the destruction of crucial evidence and the loss of any chance to rescue the victims, he chose to gather as much information as possible about the cult's methods and membership. Using his camera equipped with specially designed flash apparatus, Holmes began documenting the proceedings with a series of carefully timed photographs. Each flash illuminated the scene for a split second, revealing faces and details that would later prove crucial to understanding the full extent of the conspiracy. But the third photograph changed everything. The sudden burst of light caught the attention of the cultists, and Miss Hale turned toward their hiding place with the predatory awareness of a hunting cat. For a moment her eyes met Holmes directly across the distance that separated them, and the detective felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn night. "We have visitors," she announced to her followers, in a voice that carried both amusement and menace. "Gentlemen who believe they can observe our sacred mysteries without consequence. How delightfully naive." The 7 robed figures began moving toward their position with the coordinated precision of a military unit, while the 3 controlled victims remained motionless near the burial chamber entrance. Holmes realized that their careful surveillance had become a deadly trap, with themselves as the intended prey. "Run," he whispered urgently to Watson and Colonel Ashford. "Return to the manor and summon help from the local constabulary. I'll try to delay them and gather more evidence." But even as they began their retreat across the darkened grounds of Ravenshollow Manor, Holmes knew that they were dealing with forces that operated outside the normal boundaries of Victorian law and order. The cult that had claimed 3 victims was now aware of their investigation, and the detective suspected that the real danger was only beginning to reveal itself. The chase across the estate grounds became a nightmare of running shadows and pursuing figures that seemed to move with inhuman speed and coordination. Holmes found himself drawing upon every skill learned in his years of investigating London's criminal underworld, but he quickly realised that conventional tactics were inadequate against adversaries who operated according to entirely different rules. Watson, despite his advancing years, kept pace with grim determination, his medical bag clutched tightly as if it were a weapon that might somehow protect them from the forces that pursued them. Colonel Ashford, his military training asserting itself, brought up the rear with one of his loaded rifles, occasionally turning to fire warning shots that seemed to have little effect on their pursuers. As they reached the formal gardens surrounding Ravenshollow Manor, Holmes glanced back to see that the cultists had stopped their pursuit at the edge of the wilder grounds, as if some invisible boundary prevented them from approaching the manor house itself. Miss Hale stood silhouetted against the starlight, and even at that distance her voice carried clearly across the night air. "You have seen what you were meant to see, Mr. Holmes," she called out with mocking courtesy. "Now you must decide whether you possess the wisdom to leave ancient mysteries undisturbed, or whether you will join those who have already chosen to serve purposes greater than their individual understanding." The threat was unmistakable, but there was something else in her words. An invitation, perhaps, or a challenge. Holmes realized that the cult leader was playing a deeper game than simple intimidation, and that their surveillance of the ritual might have been anticipated, even encouraged, as part of some larger plan. Back in the safety of Ravenshollow Manor, the 3 men struggled to process what they had witnessed. The evidence of Holmes's photographs would be crucial, but the larger implications of their discovery were staggering. They were dealing not with conventional criminals, but with a sophisticated organisation that had somehow learned to control human consciousness itself. Colonel Ashford poured generous measures of brandy for all three of them, and they sat before the library fire in stunned silence, each trying to understand how the comfortable certainties of their Victorian world had given way to something that challenged the very foundations of rational thought. "The missing persons are alive," Watson said finally, his medical training asserting itself even in the face of the inexplicable. "Whatever has been done to them, there may still be hope for recovery if we can understand the methods being used." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "But first we must understand the nature of our adversaries. This Miss Hale is clearly no ordinary genealogy researcher, and her knowledge of ancient practices suggests connections that go far beyond simple academic interest." The detective rose and began pacing before the fire, his sharp mind already working through the implications of their discovery. "We're dealing with a cult that has preserved knowledge and practices from pre-Roman Britain, possibly spanning centuries or even millennia. They've learned not just the ritual forms, but the actual techniques for manipulating human consciousness in ways that modern science cannot explain." Colonel Ashford leaned forward with keen interest. "But surely there must be some rational explanation for what we witnessed. People cannot simply be transformed into mindless servants through ancient rituals." "Can they not?" Holmes replied quietly. "We live in an age that believes it understands the boundaries between possible and impossible. But tonight we have seen evidence that those boundaries may be far more flexible than we assumed. The human mind remains largely mysterious to modern science, Colonel. Perhaps these ancient peoples understood aspects of consciousness that we have forgotten." Watson set down his brandy glass and reached for his medical bag. "If the missing persons are still alive, they may be suffering from some form of induced mental condition, perhaps through drugs, hypnosis, or other psychological manipulation. As a physician, I feel obligated to attempt some form of rescue or treatment." Holmes paused in his pacing and turned to face his faithful companion. "And that, my dear Watson, may be exactly what Miss Hale is counting on. Consider the possibility that our surveillance tonight was not accidental, but orchestrated, designed to show us just enough to ensure our continued involvement." The implication hung heavy in the warm air of the library. They might not be investigating the cult so much as being recruited by it, drawn deeper into mysteries that operated according to rules they did not understand and could not predict. As the night wore on, the three men planned their next moves with the careful precision of a military campaign. Messages would be sent to London requesting assistance from Scotland Yard, though Holmes doubted that conventional police methods would prove adequate against their current adversaries. Additional research would be needed into the historical background of the area, particularly any records of unusual activities or disappearances in previous centuries. But most importantly, they would need to understand the true nature of Miss Hale and her organisation. Who was she really, and how had she acquired such extensive knowledge of ancient practices? What were the cult's ultimate goals, and how many people might be at risk from their activities? The dawn came slowly to Gloucestershire, creeping across the countryside like a hesitant visitor unsure of its welcome. Mist rose from the valleys, and the familiar sounds of rural morning began to assert themselves. Roosters crowing, cattle lowing in distant pastures, and the cheerful songs of birds greeting the new day. But at Ravenshollow Manor, the usual rhythms of country life felt somehow artificial, as if the normal world were merely a thin veneer over darker realities that had been revealed by the night's events. Holmes stood at his bedroom window, watching the mists swirl around Sorrow's Mound, and wondered what other secrets lay hidden in the ancient landscape of this seemingly peaceful corner of England. Mrs. Ashford, with the intuitive understanding of a woman who had spent her life managing the practical details of her husband's military career, arranged for additional security around the manor house, without asking unnecessary questions about the previous night's activities. Extra servants were positioned at key points, and messages were sent to trusted neighbours requesting their assistance in maintaining watch over the estate grounds. The local constabulary proved to be of a limited usefulness, as Holmes had predicted. The village policeman, Constable Bradley, was a solid, reliable man who had maintained order in the area for 15 years, but his experience with criminal activity was limited to occasional poaching, and the sort of minor disputes that arose in any small community. When Holmes attempted to describe the previous night's events, Constable Bradley's face took on the polite but sceptical expression of a man hearing stories that he could not possibly believe. The idea that respectable people might be involved in ancient rituals and the kidnapping of local residents was so far outside his experience that he could only advise the detective to contact the county police if he truly believed serious crimes had been committed. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes," the constable said with careful diplomacy, "but we've heard these stories about the cursed tomb for generations. Folks get worked up about it from time to time, especially when there's been talk of digging around up there. But actual kidnapping and such, well, that's a bit beyond what we usually deal with in these parts." Holmes realised that they were essentially on their own in dealing with the cult and its activities. The local authorities were either unable or unwilling to acknowledge the reality of what they faced, and help from London would take time to arrange and might prove inadequate when it finally arrived. Dr. Watson spent the morning examining his photographs of the previous night's ritual, using a powerful magnifying glass to study every detail captured by the camera's flash. The images were disturbing enough in themselves, but it was the faces of the three controlled victims that proved most unsettling. "Look at their eyes, Holmes," Watson said, pointing to one particularly clear photograph. "There's no expression, no personality, nothing that suggests individual consciousness. It's as if they've been reduced to mere biological mechanisms, operating without any sense of self or awareness." The detective studied the photograph with professional interest. And yet they move with coordination and purpose, suggesting that some form of consciousness remains. Perhaps what we are seeing is not the destruction of personality, but its subjugation to some external will. Holmes had developed a theory about the cult's methods, though it challenged many of his own assumptions about the nature of human consciousness. Consider the possibility that these ancient practices involve forms of mental control that operate on levels deeper than conscious thought. The symbols carved throughout the burial chamber may not be merely decorative, but functional, designed to induce specific psychological states in those who are exposed to them under controlled conditions, Watson nodded thoughtfully. "You're suggesting that the chamber itself is a sort of machine for manipulating human consciousness, with the rituals serving as operating procedures." "Precisely," Holmes agreed. "And Miss Hale has somehow acquired the knowledge necessary to operate this machine, to use it for purposes that serve her organisation's agenda." The question of Miss Hale's identity and background had become crucial to understanding the cult's capabilities and intentions. Holmes spent several hours reviewing Dr. Blackwood's notes and correspondence, looking for any additional clues about the mysterious woman who had shown such suspicious interest in the burial chamber. One detail that emerged from careful analysis was that Miss Hale had demonstrated knowledge of a local history and genealogy that went far beyond what any casual researcher might possess. She had referenced specific families and property boundaries dating back centuries, and had shown familiarity with local customs and traditions that were known only to long-time residents of the area. "She's not an outsider," Holmes concluded after reviewing all available evidence. "Whatever her current identity, Miss Hale has deep connections to this region, possibly dating back generations. Her knowledge of the ancient practices may have been passed down through family traditions rather than acquired through academic study." This realization opened up new possibilities for investigation. If Miss Hale was connected to local families with historical roots in the area, there might be records in parish registers, property deeds, or other historical documents that could reveal her true identity and background. Colonel Ashford proved invaluable in this research, drawing upon his family's long residence in Gloucestershire and his connections with other landowners throughout the region. The Ashford family records included detailed genealogies of local families dating back centuries, and these documents began to paint a picture of connections and relationships that had persisted across generations. "Here's something interesting," the colonel announced, emerging from his family archive with an armload of leather-bound ledgers. "There are references going back to the 17th century to a family called Hale, associated with what the records describe as questionable practices and unwholesome influence in the community." He opened one of the oldest ledgers, its pages yellowed with age, and its ink faded to a pale brown. According to this record from 1687, a woman named Morgana Hale was accused of witchcraft and fled the area before she could be brought to trial. The accusation apparently involved the disappearance of several local people and evidence of ritual activities near the ancient burial mound. Holmes leaned forward with sharp interest. The same burial chamber we investigated last night. The very same, Colonel Ashford confirmed, and there are similar references in subsequent decades, always involving women named Hale, always connected to the ancient site, and always associated with unexplained disappearances and accusations of supernatural activities. Watson felt a chill as the implications became clear. You're suggesting that this cult has been active in the area for centuries, with the leadership passed down through generations of the same family. It would explain Miss Hale's extraordinary knowledge of the ancient practices, Holmes agreed. If she represents the current generation of a family tradition that has preserved these techniques across centuries, her capabilities would be far more extensive than anything we initially assumed. The research continued throughout the day, painting an increasingly disturbing picture of a conspiracy that operated across generations and had influenced events in the region for hundreds of years. The pattern was consistent. Periodic disappearances, accusations of supernatural activities, and always the same burial chamber serving as a focal point for whatever forces were at work. But it was a document from the early 19th century that provided the most crucial insight into the cult's true nature and purposes. Hidden among routine property records, Colonel Ashford discovered a letter written by his own great-grandfather, describing negotiations with a woman named Constance Hale over land use rights near Sorrow's Mound. She claimed ancient rights to the burial site, Colonel Ashford read aloud from his ancestors' careful handwriting. Said her family had been guardians of the place since before written records began. She insisted that certain rituals had to be performed regularly to maintain what she called the balance between worlds, and that interference with these practices would bring disaster upon the entire region. Holmes studied the letter carefully, noting the date and the detailed description of Miss Hale's 19th century predecessor. Your great-grandfather apparently reached some sort of accommodation with her, allowing her to continue whatever activities she deemed necessary in exchange for assurances that local residents would not be harmed. But the letter goes on to describe violations of that agreement, Colonel Ashford continued reading. Several villagers disappeared over the following months, and my great-grandfather suspected that Constance Hale was using them for purposes that went far beyond simple ritual observance. The pattern was becoming clear, and Holmes realised that they were dealing with an organisation that had operated continuously in the area for generations, periodically requiring human subjects for purposes that the cult considered essential to their mission. The current disappearances were not aberrations, but part of a long-standing practice that had been temporarily disrupted by Dr. Blackwood's archaeological investigations. As evening approached, Holmes made a decision that would determine the course of their investigation and potentially their survival. Rather than waiting for help from London, or attempting to work through official channels that had already proved inadequate, he would confront Miss Hale directly and attempt to negotiate for the release of the 3 captives. "It's an enormous risk," Watson protested when Holmes outlined his plan. "We have no idea what she's truly capable of, or what might happen if we challenge her directly." "Which is precisely why we must act quickly," Holmes replied, with characteristic determination. "Every hour of delay potentially puts more innocent people at risk, and we cannot assume that conventional methods will prove adequate against adversaries who operate according to entirely different rules." The detective's plan involved meeting Miss Hale on neutral ground, away from the burial chamber where her power seemed strongest, and offering a trade. Information about the broader implications of her activities in exchange for the release of the 3 captives and a cessation of further disappearances. Colonel Ashford reluctantly agreed to serve as intermediary, using his family's historical connections to the area and his status as a landowner to request a meeting with the cult leader. The message was delivered to the village inn, where Miss Hale was apparently still maintaining her cover identity as a genealogy researcher. The response came within hours, demonstrating the efficiency of whatever communication network the cult maintained in the area. Miss Hale agreed to meet with Holmes the following evening, but at a location of her choosing, the ruins of an ancient stone circle that stood on a hill overlooking the valley, perhaps 2 miles from Raven's Hollow Manor. Holmes recognised the tactical advantage she was claiming by choosing the meeting place, but he also understood that any confrontation with the cult would necessarily occur on terms that favoured their superior knowledge of the local terrain and whatever forces they commanded. The stone circle proved to be one of those mysterious monuments that dotted the British countryside, predating Roman occupation and serving purposes that modern archaeology could only guess at. 7 standing stones arranged in a perfect circle, each nearly 10 feet in height and covered with carvings that seemed to shift and change in the flickering light of the lanterns that Miss Hale had thoughtfully provided. She was waiting when Holmes arrived at the appointed hour, her beauty even more striking in the ethereal glow of the ancient stones. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool that seemed to absorb the lantern light, and her black hair was arranged in a style that might have been fashionable in any century over the past 1,000 years. "Mr. Holmes," she greeted him with a smile that contained both warmth and warning. "How good of you to accept my invitation. I trust you found the location without difficulty." The detective studied her carefully, noting the confidence in her bearing and the way she moved through the stone circle as if it were her natural domain. "Miss Hale, though I suspect that may not be your true name, I have come to discuss the release of 3 people who have been taken from their lives and transformed into something that violates every principle of human dignity." Her laugh was like silver bells in the night air, musical and somehow ancient. "How delightfully direct you are, Mr. Holmes. And you are quite correct that Hale is not precisely my name, though it has served my family for many generations when dealing with the outside world. You may call me Morgana, if you prefer something more authentic." Holmes felt a chill of recognition. The name Morgana had appeared in Colonel Ashford's family records, associated with accusations of witchcraft and supernatural activities dating back centuries. Either this woman was far older than she appeared, or she was continuing a family tradition that spanned many generations. "I see that you recognise the name," she continued, moving gracefully between the standing stones with the fluid motion of someone completely at home in her surroundings. "My family has been guardians of ancient knowledge for longer than your Christian church has existed in this land. We preserve what others have forgotten, maintain what others would destroy." The detective circled the perimeter of the stone circle, staying outside the ring of monoliths while she moved within it. He had the distinct impression that crossing that threshold would somehow place him at a significant disadvantage, though he could not articulate the reason for his caution. "And part of this guardianship involves the kidnapping and mental enslavement of innocent people?" Holmes asked, his voice carrying the controlled anger that he felt whenever confronted with deliberate cruelty. Morgana paused beside one of the larger stones, resting her hand against its carved surface, in a gesture that seemed both casual and ritualistic. "Enslavement is such an ugly word, Mr. Holmes. We prefer to think of it as recruitment. The 3 individuals you're concerned about have been given the opportunity to serve purposes far greater than their individual ambitions." She turned to face him directly, and in the lantern light her eyes seemed to hold depths that went far beyond normal human experience. Dr. Blackwood spent his life studying the past, trying to understand the achievements of ancient civilizations. Now he has the privilege of experiencing that knowledge directly, of becoming part of something that connects him to wisdom that predates written history. Holmes remained outside the circle, but his attention was completely focused on the woman who moved with such confident grace among the ancient stones. "And what of William Hartley and Sarah Mitchell? What great purposes do they serve in your organisation?" "Every community requires workers, Mr. Holmes," Morgana replied with serene practicality. "People to maintain the sacred sites, to perform the daily tasks that allow the greater work to continue. They are no longer burdened with the anxieties and uncertainties of individual existence. Instead, they participate in something eternal, something that will outlast your modern world by millennia." The detective studied the carved symbols on the nearest standing stone, noting their similarity to those he had observed in the burial chamber. "You speak of eternal purposes and ancient wisdom. but what I witnessed in that burial chamber looked remarkably like sophisticated methods of psychological control. How do you accomplish this transformation of human consciousness?" Morgana's smile became more enigmatic, and she began moving around the circle in a pattern that seemed to follow some invisible design. "Your Victorian science believes it understands the nature of human consciousness, Mr. Holmes, but it has barely scratched the surface of what is possible. The mind is not the simple mechanical device that your philosophers imagine. It is connected to forces and dimensions that most people never suspect exist." She paused beside another stone, this one carved with spirals and interlocking patterns that seemed to draw the eye into their geometric depths. The ancient peoples who built these circles and burial chambers understood these connections. They knew how to manipulate the boundaries between individual consciousness and collective awareness, how to merge separate minds into unified purpose. Holmes felt his rational worldview being challenged by implications he was reluctant to accept. As a man of science and logic, he sought explanations that fit within the framework of known physical laws, but the evidence he had gathered suggested phenomena that operated according to entirely different principles. "You're claiming that these ancient rituals can actually alter the fundamental nature of human consciousness?" he asked, his detective's mind struggling to categorize information that seemed to transcend normal investigative procedures. "I'm claiming much more than that," Morgana replied, her voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing profound secrets. "Consciousness itself is not what your modern world believes it to be. Individual awareness is merely one facet of something much larger, much more complex. Ancient knowledge teaches methods for accessing these deeper levels, for connecting human minds to sources of power and understanding that exist beyond the physical realm." She gestured toward the stone circle that surrounded them, and in the flickering lantern light the carved symbols seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. "These monuments are not merely ceremonial structures, Mr. Holmes. They are functional devices, built according to principles that your science has forgotten. When used properly, they can facilitate transformations of consciousness that your modern world would consider impossible." Holmes realized that he was being offered a choice that went far beyond the simple negotiation he had planned. Morgana was not merely explaining her methods, she was inviting him to experience them directly, to undergo the same transformation that had claimed Dr. Blackwood and the others. "You're suggesting that I submit to whatever process you used on the missing persons," he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the magnitude of what was being proposed. "I'm suggesting that you have the opportunity to understand, rather than merely observe," Morgana corrected gently. "Your reputation as a detective rests on your ability to see patterns that others miss, to comprehend truths that escape ordinary observation. What I offer is the chance to expand that ability beyond anything you have previously imagined." The detective continued his slow circuit of the stone circle, staying carefully outside its perimeter, while he considered the implications of her offer. The rational part of his mind rejected the entire proposition as elaborate deception designed to claim another victim for whatever purposes the cult truly served. But another part of his consciousness, the part that had always been drawn to mystery and hidden knowledge, was powerfully attracted by the possibilities she described. "And if I refuse?" Holmes asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Morgana's expression grew sad rather than threatening, as if she genuinely regretted the necessity of what she was about to say. "Then you will be permitted to leave this place tonight, Mr. Holmes, but your investigation will necessarily come to an end. The 3 individuals you seek to rescue will remain in our service, and you will find that your efforts to involve outside authorities will prove unsuccessful." The implication was clear enough. The cult possessed sufficient influence and resources to neutralize conventional investigative methods, leaving Holmes with no effective way to challenge their activities or rescue their victims. His only real choice was between accepting Morgana's offer or abandoning the case entirely. Watson and Colonel Ashford, waiting anxiously at Ravenshollow Manor, had no way of knowing that their friend was facing a decision that would determine not only the outcome of their investigation, but potentially the very nature of his continued existence. The detective stood alone among the ancient stones, weighing options that challenged every assumption he had made about the boundaries of possible and impossible. The night wind stirred the grass around the stone circle, carrying scents of earth and growing things, but also something else. Something that spoke of vast ages and purposes that operated according to timescales that dwarfed human ambition. Holmes found himself thinking of all the mysteries he had solved through careful observation and logical deduction, but also of the mysteries that had remained forever beyond his understanding. What exactly would this transformation involve? He asked finally, his scientific curiosity overriding his instinct for self-preservation. Morgana moved to the centre of the stone circle, where a flat altar stone lay embedded in the earth. Nothing more dramatic than what you experienced during your surveillance of our ritual, Mr. Holmes. You would be guided into a state of expanded consciousness, where the boundaries between individual awareness and collective knowledge become permeable. The process is quite peaceful, rather like falling into a very deep and meaningful dream. She placed her hands on the altar stone, and the carved symbols surrounding it seemed to respond with a faint luminescence that had nothing to do with the flickering lanterns. Once the transformation is complete, you would retain your essential personality and abilities, but they would be enhanced by connection to knowledge and understanding that has been accumulated over centuries. You would become part of something much larger than individual existence, something that serves purposes of cosmic significance. Holmes studied her face in the strange light that seemed to emanate from the ancient stones themselves. Despite the magnitude of what she was proposing, there was nothing in her expression that suggested deception or malicious intent. She seemed genuinely convinced that what she offered was a gift rather than a curse, an opportunity for transcendence rather than enslavement. "And Dr. Blackwood?" the detective asked. "He has experienced this transformation and found it beneficial?" "Dr. Blackwood has found peace that eluded him throughout his academic career," Morgana replied with evident sincerity. "His lifelong quest to understand the ancient world has been fulfilled beyond his most ambitious dreams. He now possesses direct knowledge of civilizations that existed thousands of years before the Romans, and he participates in work that will preserve that knowledge for future generations." The detective found himself taking a step close to the perimeter of the stone circle, drawn by possibilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of consciousness and reality. The rational part of his mind warned that he was being manipulated by someone with extraordinary skill in psychological persuasion, but another part of his consciousness sensed opportunities that might never come again. "If I were to accept your offer," Holmes said slowly, "what would become of Dr. Watson and Colonel Ashford? They are innocent of any offence against your organisation." Morgana's smile was genuinely warm, suggesting that his concern for his companions reflected well on his character. "They would be permitted to return to London with whatever story they choose to tell about your disappearance. Most likely they would conclude that you had fallen victim to the same mysterious forces that claimed the others, and their account would become another chapter in the folklore surrounding our ancient sites." She paused, studying his face in the shifting light of the stone circle. "Or, if they possess the wisdom to understand what you have chosen, they might be invited to join you in service to purposes that transcend individual ambition. The choice would be theirs, as it is now yours." Holmes realised that he was standing at the threshold of a decision that would define not only the remainder of his life, but his understanding of what life itself meant. The comfortable certainties of Victorian rationalism were being challenged by possibilities that operated according to entirely different principles, and he found himself genuinely uncertain about which path offered the greater wisdom. The detective's internal struggle was interrupted by the sound of approaching voices. Watson and Colonel Ashford, apparently unable to wait patiently at the manor while their friend faced unknown dangers alone. Their arrival changed the dynamics of the situation entirely, as Holmes now had to consider not only his own fate, but the safety of two people who had followed him into circumstances beyond their understanding. "Holmes!" Watson called out as he and Colonel Ashford emerged from the darkness beyond the stone circle. "Are you all right? We heard voices and thought you might need assistance." Morgana turned toward the newcomers with an expression of mild amusement, as if their arrival were an interesting development, but not an unexpected one. "Doctor, Watson and Colonel Ashford," she said with gracious courtesy. "How thoughtful of you to join us." I was just explaining to your friend the opportunities available to those who possess the wisdom to see beyond the limitations of ordinary existence." Watson approached the perimeter of the stone circle, but stopped when he noticed that Holmes remained carefully outside its boundary. The doctor's medical training had taught him to recognise dangerous situations, and something about the atmosphere surrounding the ancient monument triggered every instinct he possessed for avoiding hazardous circumstances. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, "what is she offering you?" The detective turned to face his faithful companion, and in the strange light of the stone circle, his sharp features looked haggard with the weight of impossible choices. "She offers knowledge, Watson, understanding of forces and phenomena that our conventional science cannot explain. The price is surrender of individual will in service to purposes that supposedly transcend ordinary human ambition." Colonel Ashford raised his rifle, though he was clearly uncertain about what he was threatening. "Miss Hale, or whatever your true name might be, I must insist that you release the 3 people you have taken from our community and cease whatever activities you are conducting in the ancient sites." Morgana regarded the weapon with the mild interest of someone observing an amusing but irrelevant gesture. "Colonel, your family has coexisted with mine for many generations, sometimes peacefully and sometimes not. Your great-grandfather understood that certain forces operate beyond the reach of conventional authority. Perhaps it is time for you to achieve similar wisdom." She raised her hand, and the carved symbols throughout the stone circle began to emit a soft luminescence that had nothing to do with reflected lantern light. The effect was beautiful and terrifying simultaneously, suggesting power sources that operated according to principles that Victorian science had never encountered. Watson felt a strange compulsion to step forward into the circle, as if the glowing symbols were somehow calling to him with voices that spoke directly to his subconscious mind. He struggled against the urge, recognizing it as some form of external influence, but finding it increasingly difficult to maintain his resistance. "The choice is before all of you now," Morgana said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the stones themselves. "You may continue your futile attempts to operate according to the limited principles of your modern world, or you may accept the opportunity to participate in something far grander and more meaningful." Holmes realized that the situation had moved beyond simple negotiation into something that threatened to claim all 3 of them as the cult's newest recruits. The detective's mind raced through possible strategies for escape, but he found himself fighting against the same compulsive attraction that was affecting his companions. The glowing symbols seemed to pulse with hypnotic rhythm, and Holmes recognized that they were being subjected to the same psychological influences that had claimed Dr. Blackwood and the others. Whatever technology or technique the cult employed, it operated through sensory input that bypassed conscious resistance and influenced deeper levels of mental function. "Watson," Holmes called out urgently, "close your eyes and turn away from the circle. Colonel, the same advice applies to you. Do not look at the symbols or listen to the patterns in her voice." But even as he gave this advice, Holmes found himself struggling to follow it. The luminescent carving seemed to contain information that his analytical mind desperately wanted to decode. Patterns and relationships that promised insights into fundamental questions about the nature of reality itself. Morgana stepped onto the central altar stone, and her presence seemed to intensify the effect of whatever forces emanated from the ancient monument. "There is no shame in surrender, gentlemen," she said, her voice now carrying harmonies that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "What I offer is not defeat, but transformation, not loss, but transcendence." Watson, drawing upon reserves of stubborn determination that had carried him through military campaigns and medical emergencies, managed to turn his back on the stone circle and grab Colonel Ashford's arm. "We have to leave," he said urgently. "Now, before whatever she's doing becomes irreversible." But Holmes remained transfixed by the glowing symbols and the possibilities they represented. The detective's lifelong quest for knowledge and understanding was being challenged by an offer that promised insights beyond anything conventional investigation could provide. The rational part of his mind warned of danger, but his intellectual curiosity was proving stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. "Holmes!" Watson shouted, his voice cutting through the hypnotic atmosphere that surrounded the stone circle. "Remember who you are. Remember your principles and your purpose." The detective's head snapped up as his friend's words penetrated the strange compulsion that had been claiming his consciousness. Holmes realised that he had been on the verge of stepping into the circle and accepting whatever transformation Morgana offered, seduced by promises of knowledge that might have cost him everything that made him who he was. With tremendous effort of will, Holmes stepped back from the perimeter of the stone circle and turned to join Watson and Colonel Ashford. "You're right, Watson. Whatever knowledge she offers comes at a price that no rational person should be willing to pay." Morgana's expression showed disappointment but not surprise, as if she had hoped for a different outcome but had not really expected it. "A pity, Mr. Holmes. You have chosen to remain limited by the boundaries of conventional thought, rather than expand into realms of possibility that few humans are privileged to experience." The luminescence of the carved symbols began to fade, and the compulsive attraction that had nearly claimed all three men gradually weakened. But Holmes knew that they were not yet safe from whatever forces the cult commanded, and that their rejection of Morgana's offer might have consequences that would follow them far beyond this ancient site. "The three missing persons," Holmes said as they began their retreat from the stone circle. "What will happen to them now that we have refused your invitation?" Morgana smiled with the serene confidence of someone whose plans operated on timescales that dwarfed immediate concerns. "They will continue to serve purposes that you cannot understand, Mr. Holmes, contributing to work that will outlast your modern civilization by millennia. Perhaps someday you will achieve the wisdom necessary to appreciate the gift you have rejected tonight." The three men walked back toward Ravenshollow Manor in thoughtful silence, each processing the implications of their encounter with forces that operated beyond the comfortable boundaries of Victorian rationalism. Holmes recognised that their investigation had reached a conclusion of sorts, though not one that provided the satisfying resolution he typically achieved in his cases. The missing persons would not be rescued through conventional methods, and the cult would continue its activities according to principles that defied normal law enforcement procedures. But Holmes had also gained insights into the nature of their adversaries that might prove valuable if their paths crossed again in the future. Back at the manor, the three men sat before the library fire and struggled to make sense of their experience among the ancient stones. The comfortable certainties of their world had been challenged by encounters with phenomena that suggested realities far more complex and dangerous than anything their conventional education had prepared them to understand. "What do we report to the authorities?" Colonel Ashford asked eventually. "How do we explain what we've discovered without sounding like we've succumbed to rural superstition?" Holmes considered the question carefully. "We report the facts as we observe them, Colonel, and we let others draw their own conclusions about the explanations. 3 people have disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and we have evidence suggesting the involvement of a well-organised group with extensive knowledge of local history and unusual psychological techniques." Watson nodded agreement. The photographs Holmes took during the ritual should provide sufficient evidence that something extraordinary is occurring, even if we cannot fully explain the methods being used. But Holmes knew that their investigation had raised more questions than it had answered. The cult that called itself the Guardians of Ancient Knowledge remained active in the countryside, possessing capabilities that transcended conventional understanding of human psychology and consciousness. The 3 missing persons had been transformed into something that violated fundamental assumptions about individual identity and free will. Most disturbing of all, Holmes found himself haunted by the possibilities that Morgana had offered. Despite his rejection of her invitation, part of his consciousness remained curious about the knowledge and understanding that might have been gained through submission to the cult's transformation process. The detective's lifelong quest for truth and insight had been challenged by opportunities that promised insights beyond anything conventional investigation could provide. As dawn approached over the Gloucestershire countryside, the 3 men finally retired to their respective chambers, but sleep came fitfully to all of them. In their dreams, they found themselves walking through passages lined with glowing symbols that promised secrets beyond human understanding, while voices whispered in languages that predated written history. calling them toward transformations that would transcend the limitations of ordinary existence. The morning brought a return to more conventional concerns, as messages arrived from London, and the local authorities began their official investigation into the reported disappearances. Scotland Yard dispatched Inspector Bradshaw, a competent officer who had worked with Holmes on several previous cases, but even his methodical approach proved inadequate when applied to mysteries that operated beyond the boundaries of normal criminal activity. Holmes provided Bradshaw with his photographs and detailed observations, but he carefully avoided speculation about the more extraordinary aspects of what they had witnessed. The detective recognized that official investigative procedures were designed to deal with conventional criminal activity, not with phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The village gradually returned to its normal rhythms, though an undercurrent of tension remained among residents, who sensed that the recent events were part of larger patterns that might surface again in the future. The local church held special services for the missing persons, and families began the difficult process of accepting losses that could not be adequately explained or properly mourned. Colonel Ashford increased security around his estate and implemented new procedures designed to prevent unauthorized access to the burial chamber and other ancient sites on his property. But he also began his own research into his family's historical records, searching for information that might help him understand the true nature of the forces that had operated in his region for centuries. Dr. Watson documented their entire experience in careful detail, creating a record that would serve as both historical account and warning for anyone who might encounter similar phenomena in the future. But he also began studying psychological and medical literature related to consciousness and mental manipulation, hoping to find scientific explanations for the extraordinary capabilities they had observed. Holmes returned to London with a sense of unfinished business that would haunt him for the remainder of his career. The detective had built his reputation on his ability to solve mysteries through careful observation and logical deduction. But the case of the cursed tomb had introduced him to realities that transcended conventional investigative methods. In the month that followed, Holmes found himself paying closer attention to reports of unusual disappearances and unexplained phenomena throughout Britain. He began to suspect that the cult they had encountered in Gloucestershire was part of a much larger network of organisations that preserved ancient knowledge and practices operating in the shadows of modern civilization. Occasionally, rumours reached London of strange activities in remote areas, archaeological sites where researchers had vanished, ancient monuments where local people reported unusual lights and sounds, and rural communities where long-time residents seemed to possess knowledge that went far beyond normal historical understanding. But Holmes also recognised the limitations of his ability to investigate such phenomena. The comfortable certainties of Victorian rationalism provided no framework for dealing with forces that operated according to entirely different principles, and conventional investigative methods proved inadequate when applied to mysteries that transcended normal human understanding. The detective found himself changed by his encounter with Morgana and her organisation. While he continued to solve cases through careful observation and logical analysis, part of his consciousness remained aware of possibilities that lay beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. The ancient symbols they had seen carved into stone monuments haunted his dreams, and he sometimes found himself wondering about the knowledge and understanding that might have been gained through acceptance of the transformation that had been offered. Watson noticed the change in his friend's demeanour and occasionally attempted to discuss their extraordinary experience in Gloucestershire, but Holmes proved reluctant to speculate about implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and reality, preferring to focus on cases that could be resolved through conventional methods. The 3 missing persons were never recovered, and their fate remained one of those mysteries that official records listed as unsolved disappearances. But Holmes knew that they had not simply vanished, they had been transformed into something else, recruited into service for purposes that operated on timescales that dwarfed individual human ambition. Years later, when Holmes had retired to his cottage in the South Downs and spent his days pursuing the study of beekeeping, he would sometimes gaze across the rolling English countryside and wonder about the ancient forces that continued to operate beneath the surface of modern civilization. The comfortable rationalism of Victorian England had given way to new uncertainties and possibilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between possible and impossible. But on those quiet evenings when the mist rose from the valleys and shadows gathered around the ancient monuments that dotted the landscape, Holmes would remember the voice of a woman named Morgana, offering knowledge that transcended ordinary understanding. And part of his consciousness would always wonder about the paths not taken, the transformations not accepted, and the mysteries that remained forever beyond the reach of conventional investigation. The countryside kept its secrets, as it always had and always would. Ancient stones stood silent in forgotten fields, carved with symbols that promised insights into realities that most people never suspected existed. And somewhere in the mists that gathered around those monuments, forces continued their work according to purposes that had guided them for millennia, patient and eternal and utterly indifferent to the brief concerns of individual human lives. In London, the gas lamps flickered against gathering darkness, and the comfortable sounds of civilization continued their nightly rhythm. But beyond the city's warm glow, older powers moved through landscapes that remembered times when different laws applied and different gods walked among the standing stones. The case of Sherlock Holmes and the cult of the cursed tomb had ended, but the mysteries it revealed would endure as long as human consciousness struggled to understand the boundaries between the known and unknowable, between the world of everyday experience and the deeper realities that lay hidden beneath the surface of ordinary existence. And in the depths of sleep, when the conscious mind relaxed its careful control, dreams would sometimes carry whispers of ancient voices calling across centuries, offering knowledge and transformation to those who possessed the wisdom or the courage to listen to their eternal song. Thus ends this gentle tale of mysteries and ancient secrets, of choices made and paths not taken, of the eternal dance between knowledge and wisdom, between individual ambition and cosmic purpose. May your own dreams be filled with peaceful resolution, and may you rest well in the comfort of mysteries that need not be solved, only experienced with wonder and gratitude for the vast complexities that make existence itself the greatest mystery of all. That's the tale for tonight, traveller. Are you listening from the lantern-lit alleys of Lisbon, the snowy quiet of St. Petersburg, the soft desert winds of Doha, or beneath the starry skies of Buenos Aires? If this story eased your heart, like the episode and subscribe for more Whispered Worlds. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let sleep find you, wherever you are on this dreaming earth.